So this is number 3, the ontology of social reality, and we're going to start with the thinking on the ontology of social reality of John Searle. So we mentioned earlier the English ordinary language philosopher J.L. Austin, who was one of the inventors of speech act theory. I think it's fair to say that the other inventor of speech act theory is John Searle, who was a student of J.L. Austin in Oxford before he went back to the United States. I suppose I should say came back to the United States. Searle wrote a book called Speech Act, and it's about ways of doing things with words. So J.L. Austin wrote a book called How to Do Things with Words. So you can do things like requesting, promising, commanding just by speaking. And this is a kind of strange phenomenon, ontologically strange. This is one area where Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition were, again, not quite covering the entirety of the complexity of reality, because they didn't have a way of dealing with uses of language which are more than just descriptive uses of language, as illustrated by a sentence like, I have a piece of paper in my hand. We have a question here.
Can I ask a question about the first part of the lecture?
You mean the earlier lectures?
Yeah, the first one.
I suppose so. Yes, go on.
If it's like gonna hold you up, I could save it
Well,
for later.
try me.
Okay. When you said earlier, I have a hard time figuring out the difference between arbitrary and bona fide boundaries.
Yeah.
And arbitrary ones.
Yes.
Because it seems like if you allow for holes, like it seems like everything could, because there's holes everywhere, so it seems like everything could be counted as part of everything because everything is separated by holes. So it seems like
this is a somewhat complex question. I'm just trying to think whether I'm going to address these issues later. I think probably not. So let me just repeat then the position and see if it puts your mind at rest.
Sure.
So this is a really difficult question. Are there infinitely many holes in this room? Sounds very philosophical. It's like the old questions, how many angels could fit on the head of a pin? Now, it's clear that in the 21st century, we don't want to waste our time with such questions. We should learn what we can from Aristotle and the medievals and then move on to do something practical. Now, there are practical questions which relate to holes. For instance, if we want to describe the workings of the human body, or if we want to describe the workings of a building, then we have to understand that there are pipes and channels and conduits through which materials like air and water and so forth flow. So a good ontology for practical purposes needs to recognize that there are certain holes, but not every possible hole, such as the hole which was here before I just did that, is an actual hole. And we're only going to be interested in actual holes. They are just the ones that get demarcated, roughly speaking, through act, like speaking, drawing lines on maps, drawing lines on real estate parcels, subdivision, contracts, and so forth.
Okay, so do you think that all of our distinctions are just arbitrary distinctions?
I think that some of the divisions that people draw on maps, for instance, the division between Utah and Colorado, those divisions were originally arbitrary. Now, of course, they're very important. But when they were first drawn, somebody had a map in Washington and said, let's have this be called Utah.
Do you think that
was that arbitrary?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean everything is arbitrary, but there are some things which are arbitrary, but they are yet real.
I just don't understand how you could say I don't understand how you could distinguish between the real ones and the ones that are just arbitrary.
Because the real ones are drawn on maps which have government stamps on them and which are taken seriously by other government agencies who do things like build road signs, which eventually cause people to behave differently. Because there's a road sign which says, here begins Utah, certain people tend not to go in that direction. Anyway, let's So this is connected with our present topic because all of those things are social objects. And this is the ontology of social objects. So road signs are entities created in order to support social objects like states, villages, towns, cities, and so forth. And that's one example in which we can do things with words. We can create a new state by saying, let there be a state here. Or I claim this land on behalf of the Queen of Spain. Or I name this ship HMS Ontology. There are various ways in which we can do things with words. We can speak and thereby do. And Aristotle just did not have a place in his ontology for these kinds of social acts. And they were therefore discovered. It was a hard road to discovering them. I don't think Austin was the first, but Austin and Searle certainly made a very big step in philosophy by documenting this new category of reality. Now, Searle wrote a book called The Construction of Social Reality. And in this book, we have a little vignette. I go into a cafe in Paris and sit in a chair at a table. The waiter comes and I utter a fragment of a French sentence. I can't do Searle's accent, but I say a demi-munition, s'il vous plaît. The waiter brings the beer and I drink it. I leave some money on the table and leave. That's the vignette. And then he says, this scene has a huge invisible ontology. So, the waiter did not actually own the beer he gave me. So we have a relation of ownership, which is here actually not realized between the waiter and the beer. Rather, the waiter is employed by the restaurant, which owned it. So the restaurant, actually the owner of the restaurant probably owns the beer. The restaurant is required by the government of Paris to post a list of prices of all the drinks. The owner of the restaurant is licensed by the French government to operate the restaurant. So we have governments, licenses, we have owners, we have requirements, we have prices. The owner is subject to 1,000 rules and regulations, which the person drinking the beer in the restaurant doesn't know anything about. And because of those rules and regulations, he's entitled to be in the restaurant. And he's entitled to be in the restaurant also because he's a citizen of the United States, bearer of a valid passport, who has entered France legally. So there are citizens, there are passports, there is France, there is entering. All of these are social objects. Now, Aristotle didn't do much in the way of social ontology. It has something to say about cities. It has something to say about poems. I'm sure someone will correct me, but John the organism isn't here anymore. He didn't have much to say about other kinds of social objects, and he certainly didn't have anything to say about restaurants or licenses or prices in his ontology. Neither did Kant, incidentally. Now, so what are social objects? Well, Searle himself does not provide a definition. In fact, he says officially that he's interested in social fact, but much of his work seems to be an ontology of social objects. And I'm going to pursue some of the things that he said about social objects as if he was trying to build an ontology. And if we do that, then we can extract the following definition. X is a social object means that X counts as something else in a certain context. So let's take the license or the list of prices on the wall in the restaurant. The license is a piece of paper, but it counts as a license in the context of a restaurant, in the context which includes some office in the Paris government with a certain person with a certain stamp who stamps this piece of paper. Similarly with the president, Barack Obama is an ordinary organism, but now he counts as a president in the context of the American political system. And there is a building in downtown Buffalo which is a lump of rock and stone and cement and so forth, which counts as a cathedral. And this is a kind of cognitive theory of social objects, because counts as is a matter of beliefs. People believe certain things about Barak, about the building, about the piece of paper on the wall, or about my driving license. And if people didn't have those beliefs, then they would just be buildings, people, and pieces of paper. So Searle says that we create this realm of social objects by having certain beliefs. Now, of course, that's very complicated, as we shall see, or the belief systems have to hang together in appropriate ways, but this seems to be a good first step towards an ontology of social objects. So X is a president means X counts as a president in political context. And in a very rudimentary form, we might say that social objects for Searle are physical objects with which certain special kinds of beliefs are associated across a population. Now, this rudimentary statement is a statement which falls within a kind of philosophical thinking called naturalism. Searle is a proponent of naturalism. I think that I, too, am a proponent of naturalism, although I probably am somewhat more generous in my account of what kinds of entities fall properly within a naturalistic worldview. Naturalism says, roughly speaking, that if we want to know what the world is like, then we should see what natural scientists have to say, what physicists or biologists or chemists. And eventually, psychology and psychiatry, too, will be natural sciences in the sense that they will measure things and understand things on the basis of what they measure, following the usual methodology of natural science. They're already beginning to do that, but they're not doing it with the same systematic success as is the case in physics or chemistry. So Searle's naturalism means that all the X's and the Y's, which we use to describe all of these social objects, are referring to parts of physical reality, because that's the only reality there is. Physical in the sense of the reality which is described by the natural sciences. Human beings, buildings, pieces of plastic, pieces of paper, falling under different descriptions because people have different beliefs. Now, notice that we also say X and Y are one and the same part of physical reality. So Barack Obama, the president, is one and the same part of physical reality as Barack Obama, the piece of the human being. And the Buffalo Cathedral and the building are one and the same. There's no difference. X equals Y. It's just that X counts as Y in a certain context. If you have questions, feel free to put your hand up or stand behind the microphone and twitch in a visible way. Now, there's a big problem for Searle. Searle is desirous of an ontology of social reality, which includes things like requirements and prices and eligibilities. And it's hard to see what those things are in the X counts as Y mode of thinking. And that's because here there is no underlying X term. So what is a price? What is a debt? And I want to say that prices exist. They are parts of reality, very important parts of reality. They're not physical parts of reality which count as prices. And that creates a problem. What are they? And I'm summarizing now the outcome of this. These are entities which are Y terms. They are free-floating Y terms, which exist because there are certain documents which record their existence. So prices exist because there are documents recording prices which have certain legal force. Licenses give people certain permissions. Those permissions exist because the licenses exist. The permissions are not licenses and not pieces of paper which count as permissions. Rather, because there are pieces of paper, there are permissions. So we're going to try and understand what this page means. That's our job in this lecture. And let's look at another example to see the nature of the job. Supposing you have money in your bank account. If you have, at this point, Searle, when he gives these lectures, has a wallet. He pulls out his wallet and he waves a dollar bill. And he says, "What is money?" This is a big one. What is money? This is money. This is a dollar bill, which is a piece of paper which counts as money in a certain context. But then what happens if you have money in your bank account? In his book, Construction of Social Reality, he says, there are blips in the bank's computer. If you could wave blips, he would wave the blips. And he says, these blips in the bank's computer count as money. But that's wrong. Blips, you can't take blips to a bank or a store and say, give me a banana. The blips are not money that you can use to get things with. The blips are merely representations of money. They are documentations of money. They represent money, but they are not themselves money. And in order to understand what all of this is about, then we need to pay careful attention to documents and representation, how social reality is supported by the existence of documents. So the main thesis of what follows is that while Searle's definition, the counts as definition works to understand presidents, cathedrals, driving licenses, money in the dollar bill sense, it doesn't work for prices, debts, permissions, and obligations, and a range of other things which are the really interesting social objects, because they exist as Y terms with no underlying X term. There is no physical part of reality which they are identical to. And this is a problem for Searle's naturalism. It's not a problem for me, but it's a problem for him. And so let's now move to law. Is it another interesting kind of social object? And now we have a question from a young student.
Switching in the right way, I hope.
You're doing this for credit?
I'm taking it. Is it the intermediary, the physical intermediary for that free-floating Y term, the attitudes of human beings, which if they did not exist, wouldn't be able to have the reality?
Yeah, absolutely. You can't have money unless you have attitude. But that does not mean that money is attitude. So cathedrals are buildings. Presidents are people. You wouldn't say money is attitudes, I hope.
I would say in the same sense that you say that phantology is real. Phantologists.
I'm not denying the reality of money.
But you say the phantologists do not represent a position that relates to the reality of the world.
Yeah.
Where Aristotelian.
The Aristotelian is trying to do that.
But they are, in a sense, X and Y terms in the same sense. Talking about money. The existence is real. The relationship between that is the intermediary is the human. I don't know what.
Yeah, but still, you're not getting the issue with Searle. So Searle really thinks that he has a theory of social. Well, that this is something of a simplification, because if you press him, he'll say, no, I don't have a theory of social objects. I have a theory of social facts. But leaving that aside, because most of what he writes is about social objects. He thinks he has a theory of social objects which says social objects are always like presidents, cathedrals, and driver's licenses. They always have some physical underlying X term which counts as a president. And that doesn't work for debts. Now, I agree with you that there are all kinds of reasons why these Y terms exist, which have to do with attitudes and so forth. We're going to talk, in fact, we'll talk about that in the case of war. But that doesn't mean that Searle doesn't have a problem. On the contrary, it's just restating Searle's problem. All right, so war. We have the general on the one side and the general on the other side.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
I thought with those strange sorts of objects that Searle would say, many cases, they're speech acts that count.
Yeah, we're coming to that. So we have the two generals on opposing sides in a war. And they have certain speech acts. They give commands to their subsidiaries and so forth. And then people throw things at each other. And the war is here. This is the war. And these people are participants in the war, but their speech acts, maybe the speech acts are participants in the war, but the war is events on the ground. If there are no events on the ground, if you just have generals issuing commands, but nobody ever follows the commands, or if you have generals issuing commands to separate groups who fire in different directions, but not at each other, you don't have a war. You only have a war when people are actually engaging in fighting, or when they are about to engage, or when they have been engaging and are having a rest. So war essentially involves two levels. It involves the speech acts, the commands, the instructions, the intentions on the part of generals and politicians and soldiers. And it involves events on the ground where people are trying to kill each other. Now, that is not true of wrestling. You don't need speech acts. You don't have subsidiary authorities. You don't need to send out instructions. You just try and tear each other to bits, physically. There is a mental element, but there's no essential element of speech act. There's no two-level structure. I think, I don't understand the rules of wrestling, but I'm assuming it's something like that. And what about chess, which Searle describes as war in attenuated form? So here, the equivalent of the people throwing things at each other is physical movements of physical pieces on physical wood. And then you have the thoughts in the minds of the two chess players. And also, this is important for what comes later, you have, in the case of important world master championships, you have records of these moves. But the chess game itself is made up of these physical movements of physical pieces of wood. There is still a two-level structure because they need to be intentional physical pieces of movement. He needs to be moving the pieces in response to what he does and vice versa. Otherwise, you don't have a chess game. You just have a more or less random pair of sets of movements of pieces of wood. They have to be in conformity with the rules, but we'll assume that follows. So everyone with me so far? So chess is a game of chess. We're dealing now with the ontology of a game of chess, which is analogous to the ontology of a war. The ontology of a war involves two levels: people throwing things at each other in order to kill them, and people issuing speech acts instructing. The ontology of chess has a similar two-level structure. People, movements of pieces of wood caused deliberately by people who are thinking. Well, what about a game of blind chess? Here there are no pieces of wood. There are just thoughts on the part of this person and thoughts on the part of that person, and a speech acts in which instructions or messages are sent or records are entered into a computer or something. But there's no wood. Like war, where no one goes out into the battlefield. It's like two generals thinking that they are killing each other in some messy way, but actually they're just thinking and speaking. Now, in the case of war, we would find a very big difference between what we might call real war and blind war. Blind war seems completely different. But in the case of chess, I think most people would think that a game of blind chess and a game of real chess are, ontologically speaking, much more closely related to each other. That the game, they're still playing a game of chess, which is a game in just the same sense that pieces of wood moving on a board form a game. So, what is a game of blind chess? This is where it starts to get philosophical, for which I apologize. First of all, as I think I've already made clear, but I'm going to repeat it, a normal game of chess doesn't consist of movements of pieces on a board. Just as movements, as physical movement. If you programmed a chessboard array to move around every 5 minutes in accordance with the rules of chess, but the movements were not guided or steered by any intelligent agent, it wouldn't be a game of chess. If you have two computers who have been programmed to play chess, it would be a game of chess. But if you just have computers which are programmed to create movements on a board in accordance with the rules, that would not create games of chess, because you have to have two alternating sequences of acts on the parts of the player the attitudes play a role here. Also, they have to want to win or do whatever is the computer equivalent of winning in the case of computer. It's of chess between computers. There have to be intentional acts of moving pieces on the board. Now, a game of blind chess also consists of such alternating sequences of acts, but now they are speech acts, which merely represent moves of pieces on a board. The representations of the movements, which conveyed from one brain to another, take the place of actually carrying out the movement. Nothing philosophical there yet. I'm just here summarizing the state of play, as it were. Right? So, the idea is the following. A normal chess game consists of two alternating sequences of acts on the part of the players. You can't make this correction in the case of war. You could never say that a war consists of, when I say act, I mean mental act, or I mean a speech act. There's no counterpart move that you could play in the game of war. A war has to involve actual physical movements of projectiles, hopefully killing people. This is perhaps what it means when one says that chess is war in its attenuated form. In chess, death and projectiles moving through space are no longer crucial elements. Now, from this point of view, every game of chess would be ontologically comparable to a game of blind chess. It would be something non-physical. So it would be two alternating systems of act. I act, I say, I'm moving my pawn to king 4 or whatever it is, and you act. You say, I'm moving my queen to queen 7. So we act in our heads. We exchange information, act in our heads. We do this alternatingly. And it's as if there is a board with pieces, but there is in fact no board with pieces. There is no physical dimension other than the speech. But now there is a problem, because the thoughts in the minds of the players and their successive utterances are surely not parts of the game. But I might play chess and I might speak my movements as I make them. Maybe someone's recording them in the next room and they want to hear what I'm doing. Those speech acts and those thoughts would not be parts of the game. The game would still be what is realized on the board. How do we solve this problem? First of all, let's talk about a normal game of chess. Normal game of chess involves physical elements, psychological elements, and it's something historical. It must take place in time. Representation of the chess game in a newspaper column in which you give a list of the moves is not a chess game. The representation of a chess game. Chess game itself must take time. Must take time because the moves must alternate. And each successive move, apart from the first move, must be a response to the previous move. Otherwise, it's not a game of chess. So it's a historical sequence of events, as is a war. It must have, in the normal case, physical elements, movements of wood, and psychological elements, intentions on the parts of the players to win for instance. Follow the rules. So the normal chess game is a physical pattern of movements of pieces of wood tied to specific interrelated players' intentions as realized on a specific historical occasion. This specific historical occasion is important. So chess looks like mathematics from some points of view, but in fact a game of chess is a historical process, or it's something which is tied to history, just like a debt. Or not just like a debt, but somewhat like a debt. And it exists because there are physical acts of moving pieces of wood on the part of the parties involved. That's the normal game. The blind game is this. So let me go back. So a normal game is physical, psychological, and historical. A blind game of chess is abstract, psychological, and historical. Here, instead of physical movements of physical pieces, we have an analogous abstract historical pattern of successive states of a virtual abstract chessboard. And each of these abstract patterns of successive states of the chessboard is tied to specific players and their interrelated intentions as realized on a specific historical occasion. So in the real chess game, we have physical pieces of wood being moved by agents with actions, with mental intentions of certain specific sorts in rotation on a specific historical occasion. In the case of blind chess, we have an abstract virtual chessboard which has successive abstract virtual states, which exist because there are human agents with intentions who respond to the results of the intentions of the previous player in creating the previous abstract state of the chessboard. And going into all of this sounds incredibly tedious because these abstract patterns are historical. And if you look at the history of philosophy, they've made no room for something which would be both abstract and historical. Plato had all kinds of abstract entities, Platonic forms, triangle, numbers, the good. Frege had the truth. The whole of mathematics is about abstract patterns. There's no history in mathematics. There is a history of mathematics, but mathematics itself deals with a historical abstract entity. In the case of a game of blind chess, and we'll see in many other cases too, we're dealing with abstract entities which exist in history. Now, I believe that something very special happened in the 20th century, which was the discovery by philosophers of abstract historical entities. These are entities of a third kind. They're not physical. They're not mathematical. They are historical and yet non-physical. And it's a kind of mystery that there should be such abstract entities that are historical but non-physical. And now here's another one, a debt. So you have two gentlemen, an Irishman and a Japanese man. Yes? And they have various thoughts and worries. And they have a piece of paper. And one of them gives the other one 100,000 yen. And the other one signs the piece of paper, and a debt comes into existence. And this debt is not made of molecules. It's an abstract entity which is tied to a specific historical situation and which is dependent upon specific historical individuals, one of whom has the debt obligation and the other of whom has the debt claim. And the debt exists because there is a certain record, but the record of the debt and the debt itself are two distinct things. The record can survive the debt. The debt can survive the record. All right, now let's go back to Searle's Speech Act. Searle's Speech Act distinguishes between different sorts of rules. One major class of rules are what he calls regulative rules. these are rules which regulate antecedently existing forms of behavior. So table rules, table manners are regulative rules. Because people were eating before there were table manners. But more importantly are constitutive rules. These create new forms of behavior. So the rules of chess allow chess to exist. Because there are rules, we can play chess. And that means that by creating rules, we can create new forms of behavior. The rules themselves bring about the possibility of behaving in a certain way. Now, the whole of the rules of the mortgage industry enable a new kind of entity called a mortgage. The mortgage is another example of something which is both abstract and historical. Now, if you're a naturalist, like Searle, you're going to have a problem with something which is both abstract and historical, because Searle wants everything which exists in history to be subject to the laws of physics, or anyway, such that we can study it by using the methods of the natural sciences. You can't study mortgages or debts. Another one would be names. Your name came into existence because of a certain ceremony, a baptism ceremony. It's not identical with any piece of paper. You can use it very easily. You can even change it. But it's not something that you can study by means of the methods of the natural science. Now, Searle says that whenever we have constitutive rules, then we can treat the result using the Kansas formula. And indeed, we can in the case of chess, normal chess at least. We have certain pieces of wood being moved around in patterned ways by certain individuals. We have, therefore, a certain complex process involving physical beings moving other physical beings. But we can treat that complex process as a game of chess. So the complex physical process of movement counts as a game of chess in the context in which people play chess. But that won't work for any of the other examples that we just... A name, it can be something physical. It can be an audio-acoustic blast when I say John Corcoran. Or it can be patterns of ink on a piece of paper. But my name is not a pattern of ink, which counts as a name. My name is not an audio-acoustic blast, which counts as a name. That's because it can't be both of those things at once. My name is an abstract pattern which exists from a certain point in time. It's mine. It's historical. It's tied to specific historical circumstances. It exists because people have certain attitudes and perform certain ceremonies and created this abstract historical entity called my name.
Let me go back to the chess again.
Yep.
And it depends on what you're using abstract in the sense it's not naturalistic. It's not
made of molecules, and it's not a process of physical movement.
Right. I would say that in the brains of the chess players, there is a physical representation of the board and of each of the pieces, and those representations are physically moving around in the brains of those individuals, and then they are connected to the speech acts that occur, which give the commands for the to make explicit those representations.
I agree, but still, I don't think that you would answer the issue, because if you're going to use that to support an X counts as Y reading for the blind chess case, then we would have the physical image of the chess position, the state of the board, in the brain of player A counts as a chess game in this context. Now, I don't think that that's the way that we think about chess games. We don't think that chess games are patterns of neuronal excitation in particular people's brain. There are patterns of neuronal excitation whenever people play chess. But that's not a chess game. It's an association. Think of war again. The war is something going on out there in the battlefield. And there are thoughts in the general's head which represent what's going on in the battlefield. But the war is not those representations counting as a war. You're saying no, so that almost means you're obligated. Come forward.
Brains of these individuals are neurons and synapses. There is something very spectacular that does exist in the brains of these people. There are actual representations.
Okay, good.
There is something very, very different.
Good.
In relationship to what speech is. Not speech is not a representation of muscular contractions. It's something very different.
Okay, so
But there is an alternating pattern of characters, things just as in the rules of chess that are going between these two.
Okay, so maybe we can come to some agreement. In the case of normal chess, there are 4 physical patterns. Let me just check I'm counting correctly. 3. There are 3 physical patterns and 1 abstract pattern. There's 1 physical pattern, which is the physical pieces of chess on the board. There's one physical pattern, which is the representational neuronal pattern in the player A. There's a 3rd physical pattern, which is the neuronal in the B. And then there's an abstract pattern, which is what all those 3 have in common. Then in the case of blind chess, there are 2 physical patterns and 1 abstract pattern.
But wait a minute, why is that abstract? How does those 3 things end up being something that's abstract? Abstract outside of physical reality, it goes into some zone, some place, which in one sense is mystical.
So would you like me to put all your money in your brain?
If you would eliminate all the brains, you would not have any contracts, you would not have any money.
No, well, that's agreed. That's agreed. But now let's do it for money. So let's suppose you put your money in your bank account, in the bank, and the bank's computer memories have a little blip which says Goldberg has $10. I would say that blip is the analog of the neuronal representation in the blind chess. It's physical. It represents money. Now, if I think that you have money, in addition to the blip which represents your money, it's just abstract money. It's not. It's your money. It's historical money. It's real money, but it's not physical. It's not made of any molecules. And I would do exactly the same for the blind chess. You have the representation of the head of the player A, the representation of the head of the player B, are both representations of the same abstract sequence of positions. But that's the game. That's what they both share. That's what gets recorded on the record of the game. We distinguish records from the things they're records of. All right. So these are examples of the X counts of Y where it works. A certain arm movement is a signaling to turn left. It counts as a signaling to turn left. An utterance of the form "I promise to mow your lawn" counts as putting yourself under a corresponding obligation in a certain context. These are cases where Searle's account works. Sorry? For Searle, when you perform a speech act, you create what he calls an institutional fact, which is a fact whose existence presupposes the existence of certain systems of constitutive rules called institutions, the rules of promising, the rules of traffic signaling, the rules of chess, even the rules of war. And now examples of such institutions include also money, property, marriage, government, baseball, and so forth. And what Searle is trying to do is to develop an ontology of all such phenomena without going beyond the realm of what can be studied by the natural sciences. And that realism, which he also embraces, consists in a view that social reality exists and that it's not a mere fiction. Prices exist, chess games exist, cathedrals exist. They are not mere pretense. They really do exist. Governments exist, money exists. So fictionalism in the realm of social ontology has been a rather popular option in philosophy, in part because of the problem of naturalism. If you're a naturalist, how can you deal with things like debts? Because for a naturalist, there's one world and everything in it is governed by the laws of physics. So Searle also says, and this shows you the problems that he's getting himself into, by acting in accordance with constitutive rules, we can impose certain special rights, duties, obligations on our fellows. And then he says this involves a kind of magic. I promise to mow your lawn. I thereby impose an obligation on myself, and I give you a claim on me. This sounds like magic because all I did was utter a few words. And it sounds like magic because it truly does go beyond the realm of what we can understand if we just think things in terms of physical laws. Yes.
I don't think I see the difference between the blind game of chess and promising to mow the lawn.
Yes.
Why does promising to mow the lawn work for Searle and blind game of chess not work?
Promising works only a little bit. It doesn't work in the long run.
So there's still an abstract
the obligation
element.
So what Searle can do is say, I think we have it here. I promise to mow the lawn. I produce this audio-acoustic blast which sends the air vibrations through space and irritates your eardrums, and you hear what I say. You register it. That's all physical. I thereby create an obligation. I put myself under a corresponding obligation. This is a Y term, which is identical to the X term. My creating this audio-acoustic blast in this precise way counts as me putting myself under an obligation. But where's the obligation itself? Because the obligation survives for 6 months until I actually do mow the lawn. That's the issue for speech acts. How can speech acts serve as X terms? And we'll see that Searle addresses that question and gives an answer which is very unconvincing.
All right. So it just seems to me that we haven't been giving a lot of respect or due to Kant so far. But at least Kant,
Never heard of him.
ever? No, I'm sorry. At least he's going to claim that, free will comes from empathy, to bring in slightly different areas of philosophy, as much as we hate philosophy here, apparently. So it seems like he's basically going to claim that basically we put value in each other's ability to choose, which will lend people legitimacy, which is how government is able to put out money that is valued. It's how when one person promises another thing, it's how when we have two players, we know that person actually, it's their turn and they're able to. So it seems that, at least to me, we might be able to say it's not so much a non-deterministic but still purely physical phenomenon of our ability to empathize with each other that gives sort of this legitimacy and value to these statements.
But I'm always amazed when Kant says something that I can agree with. But I think I agree with everything that you just said. I don't think it's conflicting with what I'm saying here. We can follow, constitute, because we are so constructed. We can make promises and have reliable expectation that that other people's promises to us will be fulfilled because of all the reasons that you just described. That's completely consistent with everything I'm saying. It doesn't, and this is characteristic of Kant, it doesn't address the ontological issues. Now, this is not a criticism of Kant. He lived a long time ago, before the 21st century, I believe. They didn't realize that there could be interesting philosophical questions about things like the military command structures of NATO, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Kant he was doing something much more highfalutin. He was talking about God and duty and the cosmos. But we're talking about much more mundane things, like the ontology of chess. He never talked about chess either.
Not aware. But basically my point was, if we bring it in...
Mowing the lawn.
Not that metaphysics isn't, highfalutin in its own way, but is that effectively if we're willing to swallow that pill and say we can have this form of free will in an otherwise deterministic and naturalistic world, that seems like one potential physical process, as odd as that seems to be, to actually have legitimacy that is an absolute physical thing, despite not having any
Yeah,
point.
no, I'm not. So I'm not convinced that you're right, but I don't claim to be able to solve that problem myself. So I'm in no better state. So I think you should quit while you're ahead. All right. So but we have human beings. They exist in society. They talk to each other. They make promises, and thereby obligations and claims come into existence. Now, what Searle describes this, just for the sake of rounding out the terminology here, Searle describes this in terms of what he calls status functions. Some parts of physical reality have status functions in virtue of our attitudes, our ways of treating them, in virtue of which they can perform certain duties or exercise certain functions, but with which they couldn't exercise purely on the basis of their physical properties. There's nothing physical about a cathedral in virtue of which such and such rituals can be performed inside it, but not outside it. There's nothing physical about Obama in virtue of which such and such functions can be performed by him because he's now president, which couldn't be performed by him before he was president. These are status functions rather than physical functions of physical parts of reality. And again, you see the problem for Searle. If you have a debt, there is nothing to which we can ascribe a status. So, naturalism implies that both the X term and the Y term in Searle's formula must range in every case over token physical entities, buildings, people, pieces of plastic, pieces of paper. But now social reality, and that works for husbands and wives too, incidentally. But when a man and a woman get married, then two new entities come into existence, namely a husband and a wife, but they're really just the old entities with new status functions. And presidents and cathedrals and so on. And one very interesting thing is that these status functions can serve as the basis for building new status functions on higher levels. So we can have X counts as Y, and then Y counts as Z, and so on, iteratively. But again, if you're a naturalist, then this imposition of function brings nothing new. So Barak is still Barak, even though he's now President Barak. And this contrasts with Tibetan Buddhism, where the Dalai Lama is supposed to become something. Well, what do I know about Buddhism? Social object. So the new social object from the naturalistic Searlean perspective is always just the same old physical object, merely viewed from a new physical perspective. The only thing which changes is that in certain contexts, we have different attitudes. We use different descriptions to describe the entity. This is a very elegant theory. But it works only if you have physics at the bottom. So it can't be social objects all the way down. There must be some person or building or piece of paper or something which is the basis theory. And it doesn't have to be a physical object. It can be a process. It can be a physical process, as, for instance, the utterance of certain words. So the range of the X terms and therefore also of the Y terms includes both objects or things, but also events, as when an act of uttering counts as a performance. The event doesn't change. No new event comes into being. But the event of me saying, I promise to mow your lawn tomorrow, is treated in a special way. It's treated as an event which gives rise to an obligation. And then this is the problem with the speech acts. That this X equals Y view only works if X and Y exist simultaneously. But the event of me saying, I promise to mow your lawn tomorrow, only exists for 2 seconds. Where the commitment, which is thereby created, the obligation to mow the lawn, exists till tomorrow. It exists for months, maybe. So how can the obligation exist if it's merely a 2-second long utterance when the obligation lasts for many months? This is a problem for naturalism. which is a special case of the earlier problem. And this is Searle's response. My analysis originally started with Speech Act, and the whole purpose of Speech Acts is to create an obligation that will continue to exist after the original promise has been made. I promised something on Tuesday, and the act of uttering ceases on Tuesday, but the obligation of the promise continues to exist over Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. In other words, he just doesn't see the problem. This is all he said, explicitly responding to the objection. And now we have the army.
For some reason, my 10-year-old always has more money. I never carry money in my wallet. Yesterday,
I don't even carry my wallet anymore.
going to buy milk. I
Yeah?
went into his room. I took $20. And at that time, I am sure that a claim, an obligation, popped into existence, even though there was never an exchange between he was gone. I took the money and I owe him $20, even if I'm not thinking about it next week.
Yep.
But I think even without the utterance, that a claim and an obligation came in.
I think that my first temptation is just to say that you're a thief. And thieves should recompense their victims. That maybe you have a more subtle view of the matter, but that would be my first temptation. Yes? So this is white thievery, as is the analog in the theft world of white lies. Maybe. I don't.
I have a similar question.
Yes.
If a commitment is made between two people and both of them forget about it,
Yes.
but the commitment still exists.
Well, we can do this without having two people forget. We can just have the inconvenient person die. So supposing I promise, well, this is, don't take it personally, I promise to mow your lawn every year for the next 10 years, and you die tomorrow. Am I obliged to mow your lawn for the next 10 years? I probably think I am. It doesn't mean to say I would do it. I think I'm obliged. Oh no, we presume that that his heirs, I become obligated to his heirs. And that's only if it was a contract, I wouldn't become obligated. And contracts are promises plus the right piece of paper, roughly.
You still remember?
Oh no, even if I forget, I'm still obligated. If I'm obligated, then the fact that I forget is irrelevant. It's interesting if no one else remembers that I've forgotten, but then if no one else remembers, I might conveniently, deliberately forget. Anyway, yes.
We began the lesson here with a question on arbitrary wholes. And it seems that Searle's arguing for two types of social objects. One created by constitutive rules, the other by regulative rules. You're arguing for a third that is also created by constitutive, or at least identified by.
What I'm saying is that the realm of objects created by constitutive rules includes abstract historical entities or freestanding wide terms, which cannot be fitted into Searle's form of the naturalist worldview.
Entities are really considered arbitrary. This fit in all with.
I think many of them are, actually. If I decide that the part of the lecture room which begins here will be the part where everything to the north of here will be the part which is reserved for smokers. They're not allowed to smoke, of course, but that's not my fault. But that is the smoking section. That's the smoker section. I've created a social object, but I did it completely arbitrarily. And I think that's one of the nice features of social objects, that you can create arbitrary things like zones.
Have to do them within frameworks, correct? They're not really.
Well, in a dorm room, students might agree that everything to the left of this line belongs to A, and everything to the right belongs to B. That happens all the time.
Framework.
Yeah, go on. So what follows from this?
I was just wondering whether this was a demarcation, but could be used as a demarcation between truly arbitrary objects, the left foot and the.
Yes. I make a list of all the things I want for Christmas. I want your spectacles. I want that particular video camera over there. I want this chair. And I'm crazy. I want the planet Jupiter. That's what I want for Christmas. I probably won't get all of it.
Of course, you've given a central theme of the Christmas.
Yes. That gives me that's a meal ticket for arbitrariness. Oh, I just proved it. Always assuming you're visually crazy. All right. So, freestanding Y terms. So actually, I got him to admit that there are freestanding Y terms. In other words, I got him to see that he had a problem here. So think, for example, of creating a corporation. Once the act of creating a corporation is completed, the corporation exists. It need have no physical realization. It may just be a set of status functions. I think that's actually wrong. If it implies that status functions should somehow be dangling around without any supports. There have to be some supports, but I think he's moving in the right direction here. And corporations are a very good example of abstract historical entity. Very rich family of example. And then he's accepting that there are abstract entities such as obligations, responsibilities, rights, duties, and other deontic phenomena. I'm not sure that they're correctly called phenomena. And this is the heart of the ontology of institutional reality. But then how can he say all of this? How can he say that deontic phenomena, duties, obligations, corporations exist if he's still a naturalist? How can blind chess games exist in the very same reality that is described by biology? Let's go back to the blind chess. So, the idea is that all of the things that we've been describing, corporations, obligations, debts, abstract patterns of successive chessboard state, are documented. That the game of blind chess is documented in the successive speech acts through which the individuals communicate. Corporation is documented in the charter which establishes the corporation. Obligation might be established in a contract which you sign, or it may be just a speech act. And these things exist, but they have documentation in virtue of which they exist, but they're not identical to any document. Corporation is not identical to its initiating charter. But they exist, but they don't coincide with any parts of physical reality. So mental acts in which we think about obligations do not count as obligations. Lips in computers do not count as money. Mental acts do not count as moves in chess games. Worries do not count as debts. Even if you have complicated neurological representations, they're not counting as the abstract historical entities, for which we don't incidentally have a good word. There is no good word for these things which are both abstract but yet part of history. And so we, in order to do justice to these things, we need a new view of the ontology of social reality. And I suggest the following view. We have the ground floor, which includes social entities of the Searlean sort. Lawyers, doctors, traffic signs, speeches, coronations, weddings, and so on. Each of these coincides in exactly the Searlean sense, the X counts as Y sense, with physical objects or events. These then form a physical web of institutional facts because they're all interrelated. The traffic signs are interrelated with the police are interrelated with lawyers, the lawyers are interrelated with court buildings, the court buildings are interrelated with computers which print requests or payments of traffic fines because people drove at 70 when the traffic sign said. So there are webs of these physical things. Everything I described just then was physical. But in the interstices of this web, where you have the obligation to pay the fine or the obligation to drive at 50 miles an hour, you have freestanding Y terms, which are sustained in business by and sustained in being by records and representations which are physically the products, either in paper or in speech, of the people and other physical entities which form this ground floor of social reality. And this is true whether we're dealing with marriage or customs or citizenship or traffic law or banking. All of these things have this ground floor together with freestanding Y terms, the abstract historical entities which hold it together. These are entities of a third kind, hitherto unknown to philosophy. Because philosophy tended to deal either with Platonic entities, which are abstract, or with physical entities, which are movements or made of molecules, and they tended to ignore the fact that there are some entities which are tied to history. They begin to exist, they change, they cease to exist, but they don't have any physical part. So their mode of existence is very often just doesn't exist, doesn't exist again. So this is true of money in a bank account, which doesn't tarnish, doesn't burn, is not subject to physical process. So now let's move to the next chapter in all of this. I think one of the first people to understand the structure of this social ontology was a Peruvian economist by the name of Hernando de Soto, who is founder of a think tank in Peru called the Institute for Liberty and Democracy, which was described by Bill Clinton as the most promising anti-poverty initiative in the world. And in order to understand De Soto's contribution, we have to think a little bit about the ontology of documents. And we're interested here in time-sensitive transactional documents, legal documents, for instance. We're not interested in recipes or diaries or the many other kinds of documents that you might have. So these are some more examples. We're interested in everything within the yellow box, some of which are made of paper, for instance, a degree certificate or a will, and some of which are not made of paper, for instance, an electronic health record or a credit card or a car license plate. We're not interested in textbooks or maps or business cards or the markings on gravestone. Although the ontology of gravestones is probably... And we do things with these documents. So we there is a document act theory which is analogous to speech act theory. So someone should write a book called How to Do Things with Documents. Because documents have certain powers, so that you can use them, create quasi-legal consequences. You can issue a warrant, you can waive contractual claim. So we can do various things with documents. There are social interactions like getting married or becoming a PhD or getting tenure in which documents, sometimes many, many documents, or getting a mortgage, in which documents play an essential role. And so there are many enduring institutional systems like the mortgage system in which documents play an essential architectural role. And then we can make various distinctions. So documents can be single documents which stand alone, or they can be documents which only make sense as part of a complex document system. So if you go into a bank and you look at the mortgage documents accompanying your case, you'll see a big stack of documents, only a few of which you will have ever been involved with, which have been signed off by a whole series of different agencies and which need to be kept together. And there's a distinction between a template and a filled-in document. So when you start filling in your tax form, it's a template. When you've finished, it's filled in. Those two documents are on when you signed it, particularly. Those two documents are very, very different in their ontological status. And then the document has to be distinguished from the piece of paper upon which it's written and printed. So sometimes a copy of a document is still the same document. It's legally speaking the same, but sometimes it has to be the original document. And then we can distinguish between forgeries and authentic documents. And an example of the complexities which obtain here is the case of when you sign your passport. In fact, you carry out three distinct document acts. First of all, you initiate its validity. So you turn a piece of cardboard and paper into a valid document by signing it. Then you attest to the truth of the assertions it contains. So you make a legal commitment that you checked and verified the truth. And then also you provide a sample pattern of your signature, which customs agents can use to check whether you are you. You do that, you perform those 3 document acts by means of one physical movement. And then you can use your passport in various ways. So you can use it to prove your identity. Someone else can use it to check your identity. You can use it to you can use this passport. Sorry, you can't do that. Someone else can renew your passport. So they can use your passport to do something with it, namely renew it. Or they can use it in order to take away your citizenship by taking away your passport. So, we talked about constitutive rules, and we said that constitutive rules allow new forms of behavior to come into existence. So we talked about promises bringing obligations into existence. And now we can talk about how documents allow things to be brought into existence. But we've seen already entities such as organizations, corporations, rules, prices, debts. These are all created as a result of the fact that we have documents. We create new laws by publishing, signing, validating documents. But what does it mean to create a law? Well, Searle had an idea here. I did not much of an idea, but it was incredibly influential, and it's probably right. The reason why it's not much of an idea is because it begs for a further explanation. It sounds like a mystery. We bring obligations into existence by performing speech acts. That's it. We do it. It exists. It's like the world is like that. It's not physical. So, provided certain conditions are satisfied, we can change the world just by speaking, particularly if we're a priest. Priests get to marry people. And then the problem is, how do we do that lastingly? How can a speech act, which takes place in a few seconds, which is just an event, how can it bring about a lasting change in the world? How can it turn 2 separate people into a husband and a wife? And again, there's nothing physical which can serve as the basis for this enduring thing. And the answer, and I suppose this is what Lou, the brain man at the back of the room, was getting at, that in small societies, what holds these things together is probably memories. That's one of the reasons why people get married in public, so that lots of people will remember. And that's what holds people to their vows, that if they break the vows, then likely somebody will remember and remind them. The wife's father, for instance. That works in villages. And in villages, of course, people don't necessarily write things down. And for most of our history, they couldn't write things down anyway because they didn't have pens and paper and laptops, but they couldn't write anyway because there was no such thing as writing. But now in large societies, memory doesn't work because there are too many people involved. The spatial and temporal distances can be too large. People are engaging in transactions between continents. And so in large societies, what was the role which was played by memory and by social pressure is now played by document and by accompanying institutional pressures of various sorts. So we have buildings where documents are kept, magistrates' offices, city court, and so forth, and they are kept in buildings so that people can inspect them, check them, and to validate them and to implement them. And as a result of this fact, the documents are kept in special places, associated with specific kinds of checking institutions, that they are able to sustain and create these permanent, reusable deontic powers. That's part of what De Soto saw. So already this started very early on. So people used to create things like cities and markets and principalities and so forth by creating special documents, which were covered in lots of seals and stamps, signatures. And now we can formulate the De Soto thesis, which is that documents and the document systems associated therewith are mechanisms for creating the institutional orders of modern societies. And particularly capitalism is an example of such an institution. Capitalism rests upon documents. And what is interesting is that in Buffalo, we organized a meeting at which De Soto and Searle were brought together to confront each other on the issue of the nature of social reality. And the proceedings of that event were published in a book called The Mystery of Capital and the Construction of Social Reality. And De Soto actually knew the work of Searle. He mentions Searle in his own best-selling book, The Mystery of Capital, Why Capitalism Triumphs in the West and Fails Everywhere Else. He's a Peruvian economist who has done a great deal to improve a lot for people, not just in Peru, but in many other countries in the third world, by helping them to create the systems of documents which create the institutions of Western capitalism, like, for instance, mortgage documents. So, documents have this creative power. Title deeds create property. Stocks and share certificates create capital, and so forth. Statutes of incorporation create business organizations. All villages in Africa have something like corporations. They have groups of people who band together to create things and sell things, but they don't have statutes of incorporation, and therefore they can't get loans from banks because they can't prove that they exist as a corporation, which would be in a position to make certain commitments in return for loans, which they would then pay back on the basis of their income over the expected future. And that's why they stay small, poor village institutions, where the corresponding group of people in the West would have the opportunity of expanding and becoming rich. So, documents also have destructive powers. They can prohibit, and they can tear things apart, and they can restrict and liquidate. Documents create identities. So the identity that you have because you have identity documents is a very special kind of identity, very special kind of entity. And you can do lots of things with documents in virtue of their tremendous power in holding into place these very complicated social artifacts. You can anchor documents to reality, to the non-documental reality with fingerprints or official stamps or photographs, or by branding your cow with a certain number, which is the number that you use in the title deed that you have for the cow. And you can anchor a clinical laboratory test to a laboratory sample by means of a barcode, which you stick on the bottle with the sample, and the same barcode you stick on the test result document. And we won't talk about signatures. We've already talked about names. So let's talk about probably the most interesting case, which is credit card numbers. Credit card numbers are a really nice example of abstract historical entity because they almost look mathematical. You would think that a credit card number is a number. It is not a number, because numbers have no historical properties. Where credit card numbers come into existence, they are what we might call fixed numbers or historical numbers. They're created by a complicated institutional socio-cultural process. They are more like, well, this is all metaphor, I'm afraid, but abstract historical keys. A credit card unlocks a certain lock, a certain complicated lock in which your money is hidden, behind which your money is. And this is a globally distributed abstract historical lock because you can use your credit card practically anywhere in the world. And you do that because of the number, actually numbers, because now they have various extra numbers that you need to use. Now, the ontology of credit card numbers is yet another area where Kant has nothing to say. I don't blame him that credit cards didn't exist, but still, he didn't have anything to say about credit card numbers. Now, the interesting thing is that not just credit cards, but there are a whole series of financial kingdoms which have been brought into existence, for good and not so good, as a result of the existence of documents. So these documents create freestanding Y terms, and because these freestanding Y terms, unlike buildings and factories and machines, can be divided mathematically into 1,000 identical pieces, which is what makes stock market possible. You have a large, complex set of factories spread across the country. That set of factories has been divided into 60,000 identical pieces of value, which people can buy and sell and use as collateral. That's a magical thing, which is possible only because this thing, which is divided into 60,000 pieces, is abstract. But it's possible only because this thing is historical. It goes up and down in value from time to time, and that means that it can serve all kinds of purposes which a modern capitalist system depend upon. But this is the end now. All of this works only if we follow the rules of good documentation. And so if you go to the Newsweek in February 21st, 2009, you will find an article by Hernando de Soto on toxic paper, which means bad document. So in Wall Street Journal on March 25th, 2009, de Soto points out that it's derivatives which are the root of the credit crunch. Why is that so? Because unlike all other property paper, which represented the value in a transparent way, derivatives are not required by law to be recorded in an open public register and to be continually tracked thereby by various tracking institutions which grow up and tied to the assets they represent. Nobody knows precisely how many there are of these assets, where they are, and who is finally accountable for them. So credit crunch was caused because people didn't understand the ways in which abstract historical entities of the financial order depend upon adequate, transparent, registered documentation in order to maintain their ontological status. The result was the whole thing crashed. And in order to avoid this problem, we need to learn how to do it properly. So all of these derivatives and the assets and transactions they represent need to be publicly accessible in registries and continuously updated in such a way that people can have oversight into what they represent on the side of it. So that's the end of lecture number 3, and we have just 5 minutes for questions. By now we should be playing lightning chess. You should be up there. You can even play blind chess if you have a very loud voice. Otherwise, you need to go to the microphone. Somebody? Good.
And this might be a little bit backward from the other ones. Claim about purpose. Because Aristotle would believe that we have purpose, and
So what is the word? I can't hear it.
Aristotle,
Yeah,
that
purpose?
we have purpose. So when you say something about
What's the word?
purpose, P-U-R-P-O-S.
Purpose.
And we have that. So when you say something about an Obama, like, do we know that we have a President Obama before Obama became president? So I kind of like, is that a way of saying that Aristotle is wrong in that regard?
So I'm trying, I think, to be a little bit more mundane than that. So what and Searle too is I think aiming at something more mundane. So there are presidents, and there are people who will be president in the future who were earlier not president. And then the question is, what happens when somebody is made president? Now, you'd only get to be made president if you want to be president.